Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining our H1 2025 Market Pulse Fraud Trends. Now, I'm Cheryl Prince. I'm going to be covering our fraud trends today, and I'll also be diving into a little bit about identity fraud. I've had a lot of questions on identity fraud, and it's certainly having an impact on the fraud rates. So definitely want to touch on that a little bit. And I'm excited to have joining us our payment fraud lead, Patrick Wilshire. And he's going to be discussing some of the fraud trends we see beyond the application fraud or onboarding stage. So before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to our producer, Jordan, and he's going to go through a few housekeeping items. Jordan, over to you.
Thank you, Cheryl, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third of our fall webinar series. I can see that some of you have joined our consumer and business trends events from September. If you did join, or actually if you've joined one of our sessions before, please click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and give me a thumbs up. I'm here to tell you a little bit about what you see on the console in front of you. So each area within the On24 webinar platform is responsive so that you can maximize or minimize each widget or box on your screen based on your viewing needs. There is an Ask a Question widget right underneath the media player, so feel free to enter any questions that you may have during the session, and we'll try to address them. In the event that there are too many questions to get through, we will reach out to you individually to follow up in the coming weeks. Today's presentation in English and French is available for download in that related content area, along with many more great links to explore for Fraud IQ, KYC Connect, and Document IQ. The session is being recorded, and you will receive the on-demand link via email tomorrow. Some additional features you'll notice at the bottom of the screen are reactions, like we said. So please let us know how we're doing, if you like it, if you love it, surprise. Our survey that you can start filling out at any time or after the event, and contact us. So feel free to check any of these out, provide your feedback. We always love to see it. So with that, let's get it started. Cheryl, back to you.
Thank you, Jordan. So now why don't we just dive right in and take a look at some of the economic indicators we observed. Now, if we take a look at the overall GDP, we do see, and this is just depicted in the chart on the left, so we are seeing both overall GDP and GDP per capita are slowing down. And this is really suggesting that the economy is losing some momentum. We do see global trade tensions, that's certainly having an impact, as we're seeing exports starting to drop. And so a lot of factors contributing to some of the change. We're also seeing an increase in consumer household spending and an overall decline in business investments. And a continued slowdown, and as we've discussed before, in the rising population growth. And it's actually been the lowest quarter increase we've seen in years. So very telling. Now, looking at population and employment, we do see some signs of a softening economy. And that's with the slow population growth, shrinking labor force, as well as the rising unemployment. Now, we do see that falling immigration levels, they've continued to slow down the population growth. And we are seeing this across Canada. Now, looking at inflation and interest rate, we do see that overall inflation growth has slowed down. Common theme here. And this really hasn't been great news for consumers, not just yet, because we are still seeing the cost of essential goods continuing to have a strain. And if we take a look to the right, you will see just some of the key downward and upward drivers that we're seeing in inflation. So if we look at downward drivers, we do see discretionary goods, such as vehicle rentals, leases, overall entertainment and dining spending. But when we look at what's up, it's really the essential goods and food and rent. And so we are starting to see, again, that having a real impact. We're also seeing a widening of the trade deficit. And this is going to continue as imports are outpacing exports. Again, number of factors having an impact on where we're going to see some of the trends going. So how has the economy had an impact? Well, we'll dive into the broad trends and take a look. Now, when we look at the past quarters, which have shown some growth, and I'm speaking specifically about Q4 2024, as well as the beginning of this year, Q1, we do see that consumer application fraud rates have begun to decline, and they're actually down 3%. Now, if we look at the graph on the left, you do see the blue line, which represents consumer. You can see that year over year, fraud rates, they have been relatively consistent. And so to me, still a significant concern. Now, some of the drop that we have seen is expected. We do see some seasonality. So where we've had the highs at the end of 2024, kind of into the start of 2025 this year, we do see some of the seasonality having an impact. Now, taking a look at the orange line, which represents small business, we do see that the fraud rate has been on a relatively slow increase, and that's been continuing since 2022. Again, something I think we need to continue to watch for. Now, if we take a look at the chart on the right, we do see first-party fraud and third-party fraud captured together. Now, when I'm referring to first-party fraud, that is in reference to an actual individual owner of the identity. That consumer is committing fraud themselves, maybe through misrepresentation, and we'll dive into some of the other factors. When I reference third-party fraud, this is to depict an individual who is using somebody else's identity or credentials to commit the fraud. So here what we are seeing is that third-party fraud is down slightly year over year at 0.26%. Now, when we look at first-party fraud, it is up year over year, and it's actually at the highest level since Q2 of 2021, and it's at 0.24%. So again, I think some of the trends we talked about earlier are having an impact here on first-party fraud. And really, that is some of the indications of hardship that we are seeing consumers continuing to feel. And so they may feel the need to misrepresent themselves in order to qualify for credit. And we have seen through various surveys in the past that consumers feel it is okay to tell a little white lie. Now, here we see how fraud rates vary across different demographics and geographies. So the chart on the left here, what you are seeing is how both first-party and third-party fraud rates showed an overall declining trend across all age groups. Now, we do see that first-party fraud is still highest amongst those aged 25 to 45. And we do see that third-party fraud is highest from ages 46 up to 65. And I would say at 65, it's really peaking and going upwards. And this all makes sense when we kind of dive into the trends a little bit more and have an understanding of identity fraud and what's happening. Now, if we take a look at the map on the right, you do see first-party and third-party fraud across the provinces. And this is a little different here, this the way we've depicted this chart. So you can see here at the legend, just at the top, it is going to show you the fraud rates primarily in red and kind of getting darker. And then you'll see first-party and third-party fraud rates in light and dark gray sort of captured at the top there. And so you'll see that consistently through. Now, if we look at third-party fraud, we do see Quebec, Ontario, and BC remaining at the top. And this has been consistent. We have been seeing over the years. Now, when we look at first-party fraud, we do have some changes there. We do see Alberta coming in at top spot, followed by Ontario and then Quebec. And I have been seeing Alberta and Ontario definitely in the top 3 consistently, but what we have seen a slight decline and drop is the prairies. So they've sort of moved at a top 3 spots. Now, we are seeing a shift in the overall composition of fraud and how our members are identifying some of the fraud reasons in these applications. Now, when we look at first-party fraud, it is, again, showing some gains year over year, increasing at 3.5%. And we do see this is somewhat true as well for true name fraud, up a little bit less, but up 1% year over year. What we have seen a slight decline in is synthetic identity fraud, which is down just over 2%. Now, if we kind of focus on some of the first-party fraud reasons that we see, and you see this kind of captured to the right in the graph there, some of the top reasons we're seeing, albeit slightly down year over year, but I will say higher than what we have seen since Q4, sort of the end of 2023, is payment fraud. And when I talk about payment fraud, this can include deposit fraud schemes, bust out fraud, etc. And we are seeing this throughout many industries, particularly in banking, deposits, and in telco. Now, what is trending upward year over year is hardware fraud. And this is actually our second top fraud reason, and very specific to the telco industry. Now, conflicting information, that has continued to trend upward year over year. And this includes discrepancies in the information that the applicant is providing. But it really signifies the intentional misrepresentation. Now, something else I just want to kind of call out for us to watch for is other first-party fraud. It is showing a little bit of growth, and this includes account abuse and other types of bust-out fraud schemes. So again, some interesting trends here as we're seeing a shift in some of the fraud reasons. So before I get into the industry trends, I wanted to touch on a little bit of identity fraud and really kind of break down third-party fraud and what we're seeing. There is a growing trend in identity fraud. And so when we look at true identity fraud, it's really speaking to the traditional form of identity theft. And so this is when someone steals and uses another person's existing identity or credentials to commit fraud. They're essentially using the victim's personal data, again, or their credentials to obtain credit. Could be goods, services, essentially taking over an account. And what we do see that is key in all aspects of this fraud is fraudsters will change the victim's communication channels. They're really trying to do their best to intercept any type of communication you may be having with the consumer or any way that the consumer would be able to access any sort of goods or services. So we do see them doing their best to change addresses, even getting access to email. So something, again, really to be vigilant on and take a look at is just how this information is being taken and used. Now, if we take a look to the right, just some interesting facts here. We do see consumers with healthy credit history and scores tend to be targets. And we do see 71% of victims of true identity fraud having a credit score over 700. So again, some interesting facts here and kind of consistent with some of the findings we have been seeing year over year. Now, when we look at synthetic identity, this describes an identity that isn't real. And it really involves creating a completely new and fabricated identity by combining real and fake information. So what we see is fraudsters will use the identity, start building up credit history, maybe with smaller lenders, but essentially their goal is to operate like a normal, good paying consumer. And so as they go through this transition, what we will see is they'll try to build that good history and try to appear again as good as possible. But initially, what we might see is them showing up as thin files or even consumers who are new to credit. Overall, what we do find with synthetic identity fraud is that it can be a real complex and difficult challenge to detect. But what we will find is that in every case, fraudsters will default on all the accounts that they've opened. And I think this is why we actually see quite a bit, and we have been of late, seeing quite a bit of synthetic identities hiding in collections and write-offs. And so certainly an area to look at and focus on your own books. Now, when you think about, some of the trends that I've just talked about in identity fraud, you'll really kind of see a lot, and you kind of captured here are many of the tools or even disguises that fraudsters will use. And when we look at identity theft, we know from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre that they've confirmed that identity theft is involved in approximately 25% plus of the cases that are reported to them. So what we're seeing is these fraudsters are able to use some of the information provided during a scam, but then they'll also use that information to create a synthetic identity. So in addition to benefiting from the fraud scam itself in the first place, they're also able to leverage that information for other fraud. Now, the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre also noted that over 30% of ID theft scams happen over the phone. And I was actually surprised at that continues at that rate. So we are seeing that the phone is still the prominent method in which these fraud schemes are happening. And they did call out in second was email at about 22%. So again, interesting, phone and email, prominent methods. Now, a few other things I want to touch on. We get lots of questions around the use of AI to commit fraud. And we do know and see that fraudsters are increasingly using AI, whether it is to create fake identities and documents, but they're really focused on doing the best to make their schemes appear as real as possible. But aside from sort of the deep fakes that, I think is talked about quite often, the other side of it is how they're leveraging AI to either analyze large data sets that essentially they use to help create their targets, but also using AI to scale attacks. And so we have seen where there will be automated attacks like account takeovers. And these are some of the new ways in which fraudsters are really able to attack and attack fast. Now, another trend, and I think I've talked about this before, is really just sort of the risk with those who are the most vulnerable. And so we have seen trends around students and other individuals who are new to Canada really being targeted for their identity. And so again, certain trend there to watch. And I'd have to call out organized crime. When we look at some of these tactics and disguises, what we need to know is organized crime is likely behind a lot of this. And there's certainly some connections there. So all interesting trends, but really tie back to a lot of what fraudsters are doing as part of identity fraud. Now, I'm going to take a break for a moment, just a little pause, and maybe go to a couple of questions just before we dive into the trends by industry. So I see we have one here. Why is there an uptick in bust-out frauds, and what can we do to curtail them? Okay, that one definitely a mouthful. I think there's several things that come to mind. as really having an impact on bust out fraud and why we're seeing it. And talked a little bit about it from just even the economy, what we are seeing. Some of it is some of what consumers are feeling, sort of the hardship, the financial pressures with the rising cost of living. And I did touch on, we've done surveys in the past where consumers do feel it's okay to justify, telling that little white lie or misrepresenting themselves on an application as a way to help ends meet. I think some of the other conditions that we see is really what I just touched on with AI. So the use of technology, that is really having an impact. And I think the fraudsters being able to leverage things like bots, for example, to automate the creation of applications, credit applications, and then massing an attack. That speed with which they're able to do this is really increasing some of the numbers that we're seeing. And I also think it's the use of synthetic identities. They are being used across multiple accounts and multiple institutions. And so all of this is certainly driving up what we are seeing with bust out fraud. Kind of to answer the second piece, and I think I'll dive into that a little bit more throughout the presentation, but what are some of the things you can think about to prevent bust out fraud? Really having a real-time fraud detection solution. And you want to leverage, advanced analytics and enhance the data sources you have access to, leveraging consortium data across industry, so you can really hone in on the different frauds and trends that are happening. It's critical to monitor transactions, and not just financial transactions, but it's quite important to look at non-financial transactions and overall consumer behavior. I think really understanding the identity at every stage is critical to mitigating bust out fraud and really any other types of fraud. Maybe have time for one more question. This actually is an interesting one here. What are the biggest red flags that go unnoticed when dealing with a fraudster? Well, this one's interesting. I would say what really goes unnoticed, fraudsters are really great at manipulation. And I think it's some of the manipulation tactics, and I touched on it in the previous slide. I think that is really hard for a lot of people to notice, and hindsight's 2020. So certainly after the fact of a fraud scheme, you may notice that. But I think it's sometimes just the pressure or this sense of urgent demand that they may have in their scheme. You might not notice it at first, but this is part of their tactic to essentially build trust. And so I think that piece is what's critical, because we do see that fraudsters are willing to wait. They're willing to take time to build your trust, and we'll see that in fraud schemes. But we're also seeing it in identity fraud, where I touched on synthetic identity. We know that the fraudsters are willing to wait and be patient, trying to mimic essentially good behavior before they bust out. And I find that actually can lead to, and I think, some of what we do see now, even in the numbers, but it can lead to some misclassification where these cases that might actually be synthetic identity are attributed to first party fraud. So again, really important to stay on top of the trend. Hopefully that provides an answer. So with that, why don't we just dive right into the fraud trends by industry? Okay, looking at the mortgage space, what we are seeing is a reduction in overall demand having an impact on the mortgage fraud rates. And we have been seeing that over the past year. So we've seen the rates now drop about 10 basis points. compared year over year, so coming in at 0.19%. And taking a look at the map on the right, just kind of highlights the trends overall. And you will see sort of the year over year change in basis points. That's captured there in blue. Fraud rate is captured in red. And you will see in gray, we have the year over year application volume. So here you do see that rates have dropped and really across all major regions. But again, what we are seeing, and not a new story here, but rates highest in Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. Actually, I almost want to say BC. BC has kind of snuck out of this top 3 trend. So we do continue to see falsified documents as the primary fraud reason in mortgage fraud. Not a surprise. We have seen a significant drop actually in conflicting information, which is down over 12%. But we are seeing account abuse up over 6% year over year, and as well as falsified income, that's up 5.3%. And we do see that falsified employment up as well, just slightly over 1%. So not coming in as high, but certainly we're seeing a key theme here with documents. Now, interesting at 8% up year over year is misrepresentation of financial information. And we continue to see that. Not surprised it's up 8% at all. Now, we also see that over 76% of fraud applications contain some form of financial misrepresentation. Now, the documents that we are seeing that are commonly falsified include pay stubs, not a surprise, employment letters, also account statements. We are seeing down payment information, that's always one that comes up, and tax slips. Now, I think key message here for lenders is really focusing your attention on verifying all documents, particularly financial documents. Now, another interesting point that we did see is that there seems to be a continuation of non-mortgage holders, including first-time homebuyers, having a higher rate. And that's actually slipped up a little bit year over year. So an interesting trend to watch. Now, in the auto market, we have been seeing some continued volatility. And that's not a surprise as well with some of the affordability challenges that consumers are continuing to face. We're also seeing lenders becoming more cautious. And when we look at sort of the average loan amount up $9,000 over the past few years, that's not really a surprise. Now, delinquencies, again, maybe not a surprise, but we are seeing auto delinquencies up year over year. And primarily, we're seeing younger consumers really feeling the brunt of that pressure. Now, overall auto fraud rates for Canada are at 0.23%, really dropping about 3 basis points. And if we look year over year. So we are seeing fraud rates decline slightly, but I would say they're still significantly high when we look year over year and essentially since the pandemic. In general, I would say auto fraud is still a concern. But what we have seen, especially with our members, is an increased focus and attention because of the amount of fraud that's been hitting this industry. And so as we put more focus and controls on fraud detection and mitigating some of the risk proactively, what we have seen is that impacting the fraud rate. So we do know fraudsters will certainly move to the path of the least resistance, but they'll also look at where you might tighten some controls in one area or channel, they will shift to another channel. So it's also important to make sure that you're managing all entry points. Now, on a downward trend, we are seeing that sort of the focus of the application strategies have had an impact. And we can see with fraud rates being highest in Ontario, Alberta, and BC, that's where some of the concentrated concern is. Now, looking at the types of fraud and the demographics involved in auto fraud, we do see, again, common theme here, falsified documents, such as falsified financial information, continues to be a concern. So seeing it in mortgages, now we're seeing it in auto as well. True identity fraud is still a significant part of auto application fraud at 17.3%. And also of interest, and this is up actually over 5%, is bust out fraud, where we're likely seeing loan stacking. Now, some interesting trends. Consumers under the age of 46 tend to make up a majority of both first party and third party fraud. And we're seeing consumers with credit scores ranging from 650 to 750 were responsible for most of the first party fraud applications, coming in at 41%. So quite interesting facts there in auto. Definitely a concern. Now, looking ahead, considering some of the key drivers we're already seeing, what should lenders be thinking about? Well, when we look at mortgage affordability and demand, that's definitely going to have an impact on first-time home buyers. And we do know that borrowers who are now going back, revisiting their renewals, who previously had low rates, well, they're now being impacted by increased payments. And that's not a surprise, as we are definitely seeing an increase in missed payments. Now, if we look at auto, we do know global trade tensions, they're continuing. And we do see increased prices. That's having an impact on affordability. And so I do think that may further impact the fraud rate. Now, when we look at identity fraud, it's increasing. And really when we're seeing, and I do have concerns with the doubling of, loan stacking, bust out fraud that we're seeing in the auto space. So these are really some specific concerns lenders are going to need to watch for. But what can you be considering? So really enhancing your application review and your client verification processes. You really want to be screening for inconsistencies, looking for anomalies, and where you can in real time. You want to make sure you're leveraging tools that can help you validate documents, income, employment, financial statements. Again, we're hearing that right through. And really tools that are going to allow you to proactively monitor trends. And you want to be considering leveraging differentiated data sources, consortium data, anything that's going to help give you sort of that 360 view of a consumer. So you can understand their identity, understand their risk profile, and essentially their overall credit health before you proceed. Moving on to credit cards. Now, the credit card market may be cooling off, and we do see, and I think I've touched on, lenders being a little bit more cautious as we're seeing consumers really focus on essential spending. Now, overall new originations, they did drop 4.5% year over year, while delinquency rates in Ontario, BC, and Alberta hit pre-pandemic levels. And this was primarily driven by new credit card holders. Now, looking at the overall credit card landscape, we do see fraud rates are up 30 basis points or 0.75% year over year. And even as we see a slight decline in application volume, this raises certainly a big concern as we're seeing the increase in fraud rate. Now, looking at the map on the right, you do see the fraud rates by province, And here what we are seeing coming up to the top three is, and again, this is consistent, Quebec in the first spot, followed by Ontario and Alberta. And again, this tends to be consistent, and we just kind of see these three sort of float and move around. Now, identity fraud. Identity fraud is a significant concern. We're already hearing credit card fraud rates up. And for those of you who've joined before and in the past, you have seen we've had targeted credit card fraud attacks in the past. So this might be a sign of things to come. We are seeing credit cards really being a primary target, and not just with third-party fraud, but both first and third-party fraud. And so these surging rates year over year definitely have a concern. We're seeing first party up by about 4 basis points and third party up at 12 basis points. This is quite significant in the card industry. Now, we also found that 83% of fraudulent applications were the result of identity fraud, with consumers who have established good credit histories, scores in excess of 800 being targeted. Now, we do see conflicting information that continues to be a concern and is the second leading cause of fraud. And that accounts for about 11% of the cases. And again, not a surprise here, common provinces that come up, we're seeing Ontario and Quebec with the highest levels of identity fraud. And that's accounting for 36 and 30% of the fraud cases. So again, areas to watch there. Now, if we take a look at banking, we are seeing mobile banking now becoming the primary way most Canadians are managing their finances. So again, not just banking, but overall management of their finances. And so we're seeing about 78% of consumers now reporting that mobile banking is their primary method of banking. And this is actually up 2% since 2023. And again, probably accounts for why we see a lot of payment fraud and scams. And that's becoming a growing problem, with about 87% of Canadians that responded to our previous survey looking at fraud as being a significant problem. And about 2/3 of those said they've personally been targeted at least once. And I'm finding that's a common story in most people I talk to. Everyone has a story or has been touched by a fraud scam, unfortunately. Now, looking at banking and deposit fraud rates, they have been on a decline since about the peak of Q4 2023. And that's when we saw those targeted attacks. So we do see a slight increase in Q4. And again, that speaks to some of the seasonality we saw at the end of the year. But rates are now coming down at actually 39 basis points year over year. Now, when we look at the overall fraud rate for Canada, we are seeing that come in at 0.70%. Now, you'll see, again, the orange line here, small business, up slightly quarter over quarter, and again, continues to move up. Now, looking at the chart on the right, what we do see is the overall application volumes are up, with Ontario, Alberta, and Manitoba actually showing the highest fraud rates. So that one's interesting, especially Manitoba sort of moving up. Now, in banking, we are seeing a slowdown in the targeted attacks. And so I did touch on, we've seen that in the past 2 years, sort of a switch actually from cards to deposits. But overall, in deposits, this has led to a decline in identity fraud. And so we do see true name fraud is actually down 4% year over year. And we see the same, about roughly the same for synthetic identity fraud. Now, where we are seeing gains is in the first party fraud reasons, with falsified documents now showing signs of a rebound after declining year over year. Now, what we've also found is that synthetic identity fraud has become more widespread and across all age groups. Now, the telco market remains stable, but this may change as we see population growth decline and consumers cutting discretionary spending. Certainly will have an impact. But really, I would say, despite some of the economic challenges, we've actually seen the telco balance raise to about 3.6% year over year. And this has been driven primarily by the increasing cost of premium devices. So consumers having challenges, but it sounds like everybody is out there getting the new iPhone 17. So some interesting trends that we're seeing here in telco. Patrick, I know you've done a lot of work with the telcos. I'm wondering if there's anything specific that you've been seeing, any specific patterns you're noticing in telco.
I think you just touched on part of it, but we all know that mobile devices are one of the easiest goods to resell, and there's a high demand for the latest and greatest device. That being said, I think there's two common themes that we see in the telco space. One is devices being outright purchased using stolen credit cards. Now, here it's obviously important to have robust fraud prevention tools at the point of purchase to detect fraud. But we all know that fraud organizations are pretty good at what they do, and sometimes they can get around pre-authorization fraud tools. So that's why it's important to complement those fraud tools with post-authorization fraud tools, such as dispute alerts. And I'll give you an example. With a real-time dispute alert, basically telcos can be made aware that a transaction is being disputed as soon as the fraud victim advises their bank that their card has been stolen and used to make a purchase. Now, with this real-time dispute alert, the telco can then promptly stop the order fulfillment and stop the device from being shipped, or maybe contact their shipping provider if the device is en route to being delivered. Another type of fraud that we're seeing a lot is the use of synthetic IDs, right? And that's where a fraudster opens up a bring your own device account, keeps that account in good standing over a period of time, essentially curating the account and developing good credit. Then, a year or two later, with that good credit, the fraudster decides to finance a new phone and eventually busts out without ever having to make a payment. And this is where it's also important to have fraud prevention tools at the account opening stage, such as leveraging consortiums to identify fraudulent applicants in combination with real-time signals to stop fraud at its earliest point of interaction. Because we all know the earlier you stop fraud, the less costly it is to your business. Over to you, Sherul. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, and I definitely agree. Okay, quick time check. I'm going to get moving because we still have a few more things to get through, and I definitely want to see if we have time for questions. So really looking at the telco market, we did see fraud peak actually at the beginning of this year, and it's been the highest level since 2022. But we are seeing in Q2 of this year that the rates have started to decline. What I would say is a concern, though, is the decline in application volume. So while we're seeing the decline in the application volume, the fraud rate remains significantly high. Now, looking across provinces, we are seeing that year over year, applications have declined across the board, all provinces, with the overall fraud rate in Canada up by about 14 basis points compared to last year. In provinces with the highest fraud rates, well, BC has now moved up to first spot, followed by Alberta and Ontario. Now, looking ahead, and just considering some of the drivers that we're going to be seeing, well, credit demand. We are seeing that decline, and consumers are really watching their discretionary spending. So we are seeing a change in likely some payment patterns and consumer behavior. First party fraud. Again, we are seeing payment fraud and conflicting information becoming a growing challenge in unsecured lending. And true identity fraud. True identity fraud is a concern, and we're seeing different shifts in some of the fraud tactics, with their strategies becoming less targeted and having them sort of casting more of a wider net, targeting victims of all credit levels. So what do you want to be considering? And I think, Patrick touched on some of them, and I have in some of the other questions earlier, but really having an enhanced fraud management strategy, looking at real time, leveraging advanced analytics. I think implementing and enhancing consumer identity verification strategies, but strategies that can be leveraged right through your consumer's journey. And you also want to make sure that you're looking at fraud across the board, because again, it's not only happening at onboarding. So it's important to monitor consumer behavior, to look at those financial and non-financial transactions to understand if there's something more nefarious happened. I think this is really important in terms of keeping up with some of the trends to be able to identify what you need to put in place within your organization. So why don't we take some time now to hear about fraud beyond the application stage. So Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you to tell us what you've been seeing specifically in this area.
Thanks, Cheryl. So Cheryl took the time to run us through some insightful trend information pertaining to fraud in the credit card space at the application stage. But what happens once those credit cards are issued and fall into the hands of consumers? What kind of trends are we seeing, and what can be done to ensure acquiring banks, issuing banks, and merchants minimize risk? That's what I'll get into in the upcoming slides. So the global chargeback volume forecast shows that, we're expecting to see roughly a 24% increase in chargeback volume from 2025 to 2028. And in the past year, merchants and issuers state that their chargeback volume has increased by more than 10%. So what contributes to this growth? There's a few factors. The first I would say is digital transformation. Digital transformation leads to more chargebacks. And we know that, especially since the pandemic, consumers not only prefer, but they expect to be able to interact with your business through a digital channel. Obviously, this behavior contributes to the growth of e-commerce and card-not-present transactions, which in turn contributes to the growth of chargebacks. And this continues to challenge issuers and merchants across all regions in the world. According to Datos, 63% of merchants' transactions are digital purchases. So card-not-present fraud dominates chargebacks. The second factor I would say is that consumers are smarter about the dispute process. There's a tremendous amount of content on social media platforms educating consumers on how to navigate the chargeback process with ease. Many card issuers also allow consumers to initiate those disputes through their online bank sites or their mobile banking apps. So this knowledge and this accessibility makes it easy for consumers to dispute a transaction with their financial institution. Now that we see fraud trends are increasing, the question is, how exactly is fraud evolving? So what we're seeing is a decrease in card testing and third-party fraud. And that is because over the last 5 to 10 years, businesses have done a pretty good job at securing their payment events. So naturally, when one door closes, fraudsters look for another door to open. And they're a lot more focused nowadays on committing fraud at the account level. Account takeovers are the quickest rising form of fraud, and it's facilitated by bot attacks, password spraying, and brute force entry. Fraudsters are taking over accounts, changing shipping addresses, and making purchases using the cards that are stored on those accounts. And to add, I would say, another layer of risk to fraud taking place at the account level is fraudsters are not only taking over accounts to make fraudulent purchases, but they're also taking over accounts in the silent way where they're gathering personal data, monitoring activity, and getting an understanding of that account owner's purchasing habits. And this can be valuable for creating synthetic IDs as well as committing other forms of fraud. Another trend that's quickly rising is first-party fraud, or what we also call friendly fraud. I touched on this a little bit in the last slide, but essentially valid customers are starting to take advantage of the chargeback process as their pockets are getting tighter and tighter, right? They see a way to save money, and they definitely don't feel bad about committing this type of fraud, especially against larger corporations that they view as being highly profitable. Another thing I would say is over the last year, we've seen uncertainty in the Canadian economy, which results in a slowdown in growth. And this is a cause for concern. Businesses, in the past were often able to offset their fraud losses with revenue growth. But as growth slows, businesses are finding it harder and harder to grow their way out of fraud losses. So this poses the question, how can businesses protect their bottom line? A layered fraud prevention approach, including real-time risk signals, is essential for keeping fraud rates low. And what do I mean by real-time signals? I'm talking about gathering the type of intelligence that allows you to know about your customers, how they're interacting with your business in real time while they're interacting with your business. With most device fingerprinting technology, you can get a pretty good understanding of where your customer is located, what type of device they're using. You're able to see if they're sitting behind proxies or VPNs. And to take it one step further, you can usually create a unique ID for a specific device, which allows you to block bad actors. Now, when I talk about specific device level information, here's an example. Let's suppose you have a customer on your website or on your mobile app, and you can see that they're sitting behind a proxy. Okay, that's nothing abnormal. Now you see that they're using a Safari browser. That's still not abnormal. But then you see that they're on a Windows machine. Wait, hold on. A Windows machine running a Safari browser, it's not impossible, but also not very common. Then we see that the machine is equipped with an ARM processor. This is where things are starting to look a little bit fishy. This no longer looks like your average consumer. This hardware signature looks a lot more like an emulator or a virtual machine. So you see, these are the types of signals that we need to start looking at to get a more accurate image of who we're dealing with. Now, when it comes to fraud prevention for digital payments, here are some of the basic risk signals that every business should be taking into consideration. So the first is geolocation. Is your customer located in an area that presents any kind of risk to your business? Does it make sense for a customer to be located where they are located when they're interacting with your business? The account age. When's the first time you've seen this email or this device or this customer? Is this a customer that's been, interacting with your business for 5 years, 10 years, where the level of trust is a little bit higher? Or is this the first time you've seen this customer, which might present a greater level of risk? The device itself, is it a trusted device? Have you seen the device before? Maybe you should block this device. Or on the flip side, maybe you know that this is a good customer and maybe you can offer them a more frictionless and personalized experience. Then you'd want to look at velocities. It might be normal to see 1 or 2 or 3 transactions come from a single device in 24 hours. But is it normal to see 100 transactions come from a device in a 24-hour span? And that same logic can then apply to other data elements such as credit card numbers, emails, etc. Finally, network level information can be a huge indicator of risk. So very important to understand what kind of network is interacting with your business. And when we take all of these factors into consideration, that is how we can effectively determine the level of risk associated to a transaction. With that, I'll pass it back over to you, Sharol.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. I see we're getting close to time, and I want to grab a couple more questions here. So let me see what else we have. Here's an interesting one. What controls can be deployed by merchants to prevent fraudsters from using AI to falsify bank statements, evidence, and records? Well, first, I would say not just for merchants, but really anyone who has concerns with fraudulent documents. And we've heard throughout our fraud trends that documents are a big concern. So I would say really to mitigate document fraud, you need to consider implementing a tool like Document IQ. It's a tool that's going to allow you to do some data analysis and really leveraging AI to try and help you understand, has the document been manipulated? Has it been edited, tampered with? And it's really diving deep into the metadata to help you understand insights on the documents, so you're understanding what risks that you might not have seen before and you would not be able to without a technology tool that's going to analyze the data and leverage AI the same way fraudsters are leveraging it on their side. I think we might have time for one more, and I've got a couple here, Patrick. What protections do we have to prepare for in case of fraud or chargebacks? Patrick, think you take that one?
Yeah, good question. So I would say when it comes to preventing fraud and chargebacks, it's important to consider all of the points of interaction where fraud can take place. Having a strategy where you can